Welcome to an hour of HealthMade Radio. HealthMade is a community for natural health seekers where we educate people about common health conditions and share extensive research on the most effective natural health treatments and promote legislation that protects our health freedoms. A core concept belief is in the innate intelligence and healing power of the body, and if properly supported spiritually, emotionally, and nutritionally, it can find its way back to health. HealthMade Radio will bring information from integrative health experts throughout the world. Check us out at healthmade.co. Health is what you make it. I'm Dr. Michael Karlfeldt, and I will be your host. Today's guest is Leigh Dundas. In this time of unprecedented encroachment into our civil liberties, renowned human rights attorney Leigh Dundas and her nonprofit organization, Advocates for Citizens' Rights, are moving swiftly to address issues involving mandatory mask wearing and social distancing, as well as quarantine and contact tracing measures. Leigh Dundas began her career in the early 90s, representing Fortune 500 companies in multi-million-dollar legal battles in the courtroom, before transitioning over the last decade to working with nonprofits dedicated to combating the child sex slavery epidemic in Southeast Asia. In March of this year, she took the lessons she learned battling industry behemoth in white-collar courtrooms and fighting mafia syndicates in the trenches of third world countries and began using them to turn the tide on the human rights atrocities our governments have been deploying on a peaceful population under the guise of a pandemic that is no more fatal than the average flu. Leigh, I'm so excited to have you on the show today and really dig into this subject. Thank you so much.
As am I. It's a privilege to be here. I'm glad that you extended the invitation. Can't wait to chat.
I am curious. So what made you initially transition from being I would say, a corporate lawyer on a high level, dealing with Fortune 500 companies, and then moving into human rights?
You know, it's an interesting question. Back in 2013, we had taken some time, my husband and young daughter and I, to travel to Australia and New Zealand. I got bored. Shh, don't tell my family. I got a little bit bored because I'm just not used to not working. And I had always had an interest in human rights work, in sexual violence, in child abuse. It's what I had studied in college before I'd gone to law school. And I had kept abreast of developments legally in those areas just as a hobby when I was doing regular corporate litigation. And so I found myself with some time on my hands and really just, felt moved to see what I could do to help. I was older at that point. I wasn't a young lawyer anymore. I was looking around the planet and realizing that there's, corporate lawyers are a dime a dozen. There's as many as you could shake a stick at on every street corner in urban America. But the amount of attorneys who are willing to sort of jump into the fight and work for nonprofits and fight things like child sex slavery or abuse or human rights issues in third world countries is a much tinier pond. It's a much tinier playing field. And I was just convinced at that point that time was short and my skills could be better spent doing something that everybody else was not doing and that really needed the skill sets that I had. So I started just reaching out, cold calling entities in Australasia that were doing work in that realm, that were fighting human trafficking and child sex slavery. And most of them laughed. They said, "Oh, corporate lawyer from America, yeah, we don't have time for you." But I finally got hooked up with some people, ironically, who were based in America but doing work in Vietnam and other Southeast Asia countries and parts of Europe who wanted to meet, and they were going to be in Vietnam. They invited me to the meeting. We hit it off like a house on fire, and I volunteered my time working my way across Southeast Asia. We were traveling, but I was also doing volunteer work for the anti-sex slavery nonprofit at that point. And when I came home, I had a new job, and I haven't looked back.
Oh, and this kind of job, I mean, it sounds like it was kind of a peaceful. I mean, here you're addressing the child sex slavery, which is, I mean, it's a huge concern. Was that kind of a peaceful endeavor, non-stressful, non-threatening? I mean, you're dealing with mafia, you're dealing with Asian banking conglomerates. I would assume that they didn't appreciate what you were doing.
It was kind of the opposite of peaceful. Peaceful would be practicing corporate law in Newport Beach, California. What I ended up doing, I was general counsel for the nonprofit that I ended up working for back in 2013, which sounds like a very lawyerly type position, but in point of fact, they were looking to open up their Southeast Asia office, and so I was spending about half of my time on the ground in third world countries in Asia, hiring undercover guys to go into the child brothels and pose as sex buyers. And one of the first jobs I had was ordering equipment that I had only ever seen on nighttime primetime TV and in movies, where you're outfitting your guys with high definition, low light capability audio video recording devices that are nestled into watches or hats or pens. It was very 007. My child or husband would cruise by my computer and they'd be like, "What are you doing?" And I'm like, "Oh, I'm online shopping for these devices that I'd only ever read about in a mystery novel before." So, and then it was a bit ironic because I'm a Caucasian female from Orange County, but I was spending a lot of time in Asia, and some of the time it was in a Bangkok high-rise where we were doing interviews, and it was very similar to something I would be doing in LA, but a lot of the time I was in a back alley with rats the size of cats that would actually scare the actual cats out. And one of the towns we work in was on the Malaysia border with Thailand, and I think last calendar year they had 300 bombs go off, because it's not just a town that has 140 child brothels in it. The town is also, they call it the red light jihadi district, because the radicalized insurgent bombers in certain religions are looking to make that be their ground zero training ground. So that's their practice area for target practice on suicide bombing, if you will. So it was definitely not peaceful and definitely not safe. And I came to an understanding that I probably had picked the wrong body this lifetime. I should have picked a big 6'5" burly Navy SEAL person to walk this planet on, because it was much more in keeping with what I liked to do. Who knew that I would have found such joy in the work that I did? But yeah, I got to hire some of these guys we worked with. I got to work with them closely. We got to work with a lot of the governments down there so that we could not just find out what was going on, but put the bad guys away. And it was a very enjoyable career, but 180 degrees opposite of what I had ever done previously.
Yeah, and I mean, thank you so much, because it's such a huge issue. And I'm curious. I mean, from that is so important to address. And now you move to something that, I mean, you must feel that it's even more important, dealing now with the mask mandates that is being pushed by governmental agencies and the government, quarantine and the social distancing, or I would say more anti-social distancing. Why did you feel that this was more important? I mean, why did you shift to this then?
Well, I think the first thing I would say in answer to your question is the fact that I shifted should scare the listeners listening to your program more than any other single piece of data or story I tell today. Because when you have a person who is fighting $150 billion with a B dollar a year industry, which is the second largest criminal economy in the world and the fastest growing criminal economy in the world, and by that I mean human slavery, and when I'm working in third world countries where bombs are going off every day and 7-year-olds are being raped 10 times a night for profit, and I am suddenly compelled to quit doing that work cold turkey and pivot on a dime to doing some work here in California, particularly given how passionate of a person I am, that should tell you everything you need to know about how damn serious I think the situation, not just in California and in Southern California is, but in our country is right now. I stopped doing that work because, in a nutshell, I had judged the violations that were starting to occur in the U.S. to be on par with and potentially more dangerous than the work that I was doing in terms of trying to save children and young women from slavery in Asia. And so that is why I turned my attention here. I think that my decision was informed, and I think a lot of people raised their eyebrows early on at my pivot and my statements, and they said, oh, she's just spitting words out, and she's just running around screaming about the sky falling like Chicken Little, and this is just a 2 week to flatten the curve. And I think for many Americans, I don't begrudge them their point of view. They're rather head in the sand, I think, but nonetheless point of view. I think if I had had a different trajectory, I might have believed that that was, in fact, all that was occurring. But when you work fighting the mafia in bombed-out villages, when you work in countries like Cambodia that have had a genocide during my lifetime, during your lifetime, Doc, that lived through a genocide in the late 70s, when you've talked firsthand to survivors of the Holocaust, of these Cambodian genocides, of these genocides that happened in Africa, what you rapidly realize is that nobody who is intent on committing evil or a takeover or even just a simple human rights abuse, at no point do they typically telegraph it and use crystal clear language to let the target know what's coming. I mean, because then they would have a mass revolution on their hands. They'd have a fight. So they, by and large, typically slow boil the frog. They soft shoe it. They tap dance. They speak euphemistically. They tell you it's just for a little while. They tell you it's not that bad. They tell you it's for your own good. But if you've worked in countries where these things have happened and you've talked to survivors, you start to recognize the telltale signs, the tip of the iceberg, and see it as not just this floating white thing in the water, but an iceberg that 90% of which is hidden, but it's going to take out your ship if you don't steer clear. And so that is why I turned my attention to fighting what I believe is a far more dangerous unfolding of events here in America.
We're going to take a quick break. You're listening to Helpmate Radio. I'm Dr. Michael Karlfeldt. I'm here with human rights attorney Leigh Dundas. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Helpmate Radio. I'm Dr. Michael Karlfeldt. I'm here with Leigh Dundas, a very renowned human rights attorney that's been fighting the mafia and Asian banking conglomerates, working for the Department of Defense. And right now we are focusing and facing something that she feels is even more dangerous than what she's fought in the past. And I'm really curious because exactly what you're saying, the slow boiling of the frog, I mean, what made you recognize that all of a sudden what you were seeing in Asia and, where you've had Holocaust, where you've had extinction of certain groups of people, what made you recognize the same patterns here in the United States that was going on over there?
Well, a couple of things. First of all, it was a bit of a false flag, which I was able to see again, perhaps maybe quicker than some, just by good luck or dumb luck or whatever you want to call it. But I've done a lot of work consulting in healthcare. I have a lot of friends who are doctors, family members. And, we rapidly started looking at the statistics and realizing that what we were all worried about this disease being was not, in fact, what it was turning out to be. They were talking about it like it was going to be some Ebola on steroids, where if somebody sneezed on you in line at the grocery store, you would be hemorrhaging from every orifice you had like 5 minutes later and dying. And I think, to be perfectly honest, if there were a disease like that running rampant through America, nobody would have to ask us to go into lockdown. Every single American who had a brain would be hiding in their basement, cowering in fear, and rightly so, including me. But this disease was not turning into what it was advertised to be. It was no more fatal than the flu. It was affecting one demographic really the most, which was a demographic that, no offense to that demographic, was probably 2/3 of them were going to die anyway. They, on average, were over the age of 80, sometimes over the age of 90. They had 2 or 3 comorbidities, other underlying conditions that were going to take them out of commission this year anyway, even if COVID had not come into their universe. And the children, that everybody is so darn concerned about with this month because of the school issue, are basically immune. According to the CDC, if you're under the age of 19 in the United States, your risk of dying from COVID-19 is so low it's calculated at 0.0%. And so the first thing that I noticed was a disparity between the narrative that was being put forth and the actuality of what the disease entailed. I also happened to be, my ex-boyfriend from many decades ago, happened to be in Italy on a ski trip And one of the first folks that was diagnosed with COVID, along with every other old fraternity friend of his and their ski party, there were like 15 guys who go skiing every year, and they were skiing in the Italian Alps, and one of the guys felt bad. One morning, he had asthma, right? He had an underlying condition, ended up going to an urgent care, got diagnosed with COVID. According to legend, or how I heard about the story, had he not gone to urgent care, none of them would have figured out that they had COVID. He tested positive. The whole group got tested. They all tested positive. From what I heard, it was a non-event. There's people I know who've had COVID, including those guys apparently who, they'll tell you when you ask, I've had worse things from my 3-year-old in preschool 2 years ago, So it was not the incredibly fatal, fast-moving disease that was going to wipe out the planet that it had been advertised as. Nonetheless, the media lit onto it like a moth to a flame, and they started enacting very draconian restrictions. And you saw an incredible and a very quick consolidation of power from the 3 branches of government that America is based on in our constitutional republic, where you've got the executive and the legislative and the judicial, which are all supposed to act as checks and balances on each other, to basically having lame ducks for 2 of those branches, judicial and legislative, with just the executive branch in gear. And in California, our great governor, and I say that facetiously, in the last few months has changed over 400 laws using his executive order powers. Communication was curtailed, travel was curtailed. There was no reason to do so based on the fact that this disease was less fatal than the flu up until recently, and even now is only on par with the bad flu season. And those are all things you see in socialist countries, socialist headed toward communist. And you couldn't really get the real word out. As you're well aware, last week or a few days ago, 20-some-odd doctors gathered on the Supreme Court steps, had a 7-hour press conference, and you had 20 well-respected doctors. I know some of them. Dr. Simone Gold is a double JD MD. I think, if I'm not mistaken, it was U of Chicago and Stanford. This is not a woman who graduated from a backwoods school somewhere, and they are standing on these steps saying, this is the truth. You take hydroxychloroquine, you pair it with 2 other things. This disease does not have to be fatal. And you've got kids out of college who were lucky enough to create a media platform called Facebook, to acting as Facebook fact checkers, who are taking down their truth as quickly as they can get it out. These are the things you see when you travel to Southeast Asian countries or anywhere else in the world where they have dictatorships, where they have unilateral governments, where the people are oppressed, and where the people have no say, and you have a ruling single ruler who can do as they wish. And if you have a benevolent ruler, you're lucky, and if you're not lucky, you have a dictator. And those are breeding grounds for human rights abuses. And I was seeing signs of this early on, where I think many people who weren't raised, who were raised in America just weren't aware. The people I know who immigrated here saw it immediately. The Asian families I know who left their countries to come here, the Yugoslavian families I know, the Serbs, the Croatians who left their countries, who remember what it was like in the 90s when this was happening in their country, they were screaming as loud as I was from the get-go. But everybody else was going, no, it's just 2 weeks to flatten the curve.
And it's fascinating because and I see that as well, the people that have been in other countries where they have been oppressed, they see the patterns. But it's almost like Americans are feeling privileged of all the rights that they have, so they feel bad to fight for them. I mean, they feel bad. I can give a little bit to help somebody else, and not recognizing that giving a little bit is then letting go of their civil liberties, and now all of a sudden they don't have those rights anymore.
That's right. They don't realize that by giving an inch, a mile is going to get taken from them, and it's ground they will be unlikely to ever regain. And, as sad as it is, people were coming up to me a week ago and saying, look at how many people were in the streets in Germany. And, I mean, there were millions there. And all you have to do is look at one of the top-down photos to see that they have scads of people out in the streets in Germany who were up in arms. And everybody's, doing side-by-side shots of the rallies here and, compared to Germany's and saying, this is so sad and why the difference? And, my immediate off-the-cuff rejoinder is, well, Germany is fairly fresh off, 70 years ago, its own dark day where it turned a blind eye to tyranny and had one hell of a reckoning as a result. We being America, are 3 centuries off the last real good time that we fought down tyranny, and we have forgotten the lessons. And it should be a wake-up call to everybody listening to this. You need to listen to the people who have come from other countries or worked in other countries, because when they are screaming and telling you where there's smoke, there's fire, they are probably the people who can see it the most clearly.
So right now, I mean, we like Governor Newsom, which has happened here in Idaho, and I know in the majority of the states, they're declaring then a declaration of emergency, and that gives them the so-called right to change laws and then eliminate the other branches of government and just function on its own. So this declaration of emergency, I mean, is that legal to do under these circumstances?
Well, that's an interesting question. In California, the way the government code statute is written is that the governor can declare a state of emergency when there's any one of a number of triggers for it. Natural disasters are the big grouping, earthquakes, fires, hurricanes, not that we have those here, but, things of that nature, floods, things like that, tidal waves. But one of the triggers is also an epidemic. So if there were a legitimate epidemic, and by that I mean something that was threatening to overwhelm the healthcare resources, then the declaration of emergency would be valid. Unfortunately, the way our state statute is written here is he is supposed to call off the state of emergency as soon as is practical, which, we've got 2 problems. One, there is no epidemic. This is no worse than a flu season. It's certainly not overwhelming our capacity, and I'm certain that the same is true for Idaho and Nebraska and everywhere else in the country. Secondly, in fact, what's happening here, Cedars-Sinai has been shutting down whole wings. You go into hospitals, they have whole wings that are dark where they furloughed the doctors and the nurses or fired them or let them go, and whole wings have been shut down because the hospitals are so not overwhelmed. They're actually a ghost town. They're actually at danger of folding monetarily and going bankrupt. So we clearly don't have an epidemic the way we would measure that. What I've seen, unfortunately, is that the judiciary, to the extent it's actually being used right now, has been loath to ride herd and second-guess a governor's decision. So if the governor says it's an epidemic, even if the rest of us are kind of raising our eyebrows and going, really? Because it doesn't seem any worse than the 2018 flu season, the judge is kind of not in the position of wanting to say, yeah, it's not an epidemic. I think for fear that then there'll be a surge, some horrible thing will happen, and everybody will be blaming the judge for having reopened things prematurely. And so the judiciary has been unwilling and unfortunately reticent to hold the governors in check unless, some states have more clearly written guidelines by which time the state of emergency is supposed to end, 60 days out or something like that. Ours is very muddy, and there's been no end in sight, and that's a problem. It's a distinct problem, which was not evident until the abuse of the state of emergency this year, 2020, started to occur. But yeah, it's not an epidemic. If it were, would they be within their rights? Yes, but it's not factually, but the judges aren't willing to rule on the facts, so you're back in this gray area of a governor who's acting like a king or an emperor with no checks and balances.
We're going to take a quick break. You're listening to Health Made Radio. I'm Dr. Michael Karlfeldt. I'm here with Leigh Dundas. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Health Made Radio. I'm Dr. Michael Karlfeldt. I'm here with Leigh Dundas, and we're talking about the masking, the social distancing, the quarantine as human rights violations, and discussing what impact or what legal background that is behind being able to do this. So how could legally, how can the governor then be challenged, and how can this legally be stopped?
Well, you've got two or three routes. You've got the ability in many states to recall the governor, which is occurring here in California. We've got quite the recall effort going on, and the governor knows it, which is why he shut down all of our beaches over the 4th of July and all of our restaurants, because he knew that people were going to be gathering signatures to get this on the recall on the ballot. So we can recall these emperors who are acting in a way that many feel are beyond their rightful authority. We can continue as lawyers to file challenges to the exceeding of their scope of authority. Recently here in California, there was a challenge filed by one of our assemblymen, one of our legislators who's an attorney. I think it was the 40th executive order our governor made relating to voting, and finally 2 lawyers who were assemblymen and legislators filed, I think, up in Sutter County, and the judge had some guts, and he came out and he said, I am issuing a temporary restraining order restraining the governor from issuing any more executive orders until I had this being heard at a full hearing on the merits, because it was sort of a temporary restraining order move. And of course, our governor appealed it, so now they're fighting out the initial injunction that stays his hand at the appellate court level, so we'll see where that goes. The legislature can get together in any state. If you've got a sane legislature, we don't necessarily have that here in California. We have a supermajority Democratic-led legislature that will typically act in lockstep with the governor, although I will say, behind the scenes and off the record, it's a testament to how pissed off people are that even a lot of the Democrats and the legislators who are the friends of our governor behind closed doors are saying, wow, even we think he's gone too far at this point. But if you can get your legislature to make a new law, put the new law in the book saying the state of emergency has to end, or it minimally has to be reviewed under X, Y, and Z criteria, that would be a way, make new law that puts some constraints on the governor's powers during these times of emergency. And then the fourth thing that you can do, and it's not a legal move, it's more of a, all the things we learned and didn't want to learn in 4th grade on the playground move, is, we've got friends, and by that I mean the federal government right now, Attorney General William Barr and the President Trump have come out and said, we are going to jawbone the governors that are acting outside their correct lanes, that are outside their authority, that are doing things that we think are wrong. And they've got the ability to sort of chew the backside of these governors informally, and they have the ability to join lawsuits that are filed against the governors formally. They can move to intervene in lawsuits that are filed which makes a statement to the court. When you've got the power of the feds, the Department of Justice coming in and saying, well, X and Y lawyer on behalf of X and Y plaintiff filed this lawsuit, but we, the Department of Justice and the federal government, think that they are correct and we're lending our weight to this lawsuit. That's a heavy statement for the judge to deal with politically. But also off the record, the feds can call up these governors and say, you keep doing this and you keep blackmailing the counties, which is what our state's doing right now. Every time we turn around, Newsom is blackmailing one of the counties saying, if you don't do what I say, if you don't make your sheriff enforce the masks, if you open up your businesses without my blessing, if you let your private schools and public schools get open without my blessing, I'm going to withhold all your money from you next year. Well, you know what? Screw them. 2 people can play that game. The feds can come in and say, if you do that, Governor, we're going to do the same to you. We're going to withhold all your federal money next year. And I think the time is ripe. I think it is overripe for the feds to can play that game, 2 can tango. Governors want to blackmail the counties. The feds can blackmail the governors. And I think it's high time that occurs.
And so with what's going on, I mean, I know you made the point that this is not only going after our First Amendment, but our right to speak, and but also you were talking about it's impacting our 13th Amendment also in regards to what's going on. I mean, why would you say that?
Well, we have lots of rights that we seem to have forgotten about under our Constitution. The First Amendment, of course, protects our right to speak. It also protects our right to gather peaceably, our right to petition for redress of grievances, and our right to religion. All of those have been trampled in most states that are in the control of Democrat governors, certainly in California. Second Amendment, we have the right to bear arms. Fourth Amendment, 14th Amendment, we have rights to privacy. We have the right to be free of unreasonable searches and seizures. We have the right to not be slaves and indentured servants under a variety of these, interplay of these various amendments. And when you tell people they can't travel, or they must wear a piece of clothing. I mean, if you take this out of the context of the last 4 months, if I had come up to you, Doc, and back at Christmas time last year said, Michael, you're wearing a burqa. or you're going to have to wear a type of hat on your head, or you're going to have to, always make sure you're wearing turtlenecks outside, no matter the weather, you would have laughed, and I would have laughed. And if I had gone to the police and said, you need to make this man wear this outfit or else, nobody in their right minds would have enforced that. Everybody would have laughed. And they would have understood, even if they'd never had a history class or a constitutional law class, that in America, we can't do that to each other. We have the right to freedom of expression. We have the right to be free from compelled expression, which is what mask wearing is. A lot of people have religious objections. A lot of people have free speech objections. They're saying covering my face is virtue signaling in a way that I don't agree with. It's forcing me to give a message I don't agree with, or it's medically harming me. I don't agree with this on a medical front, and they're right. It causes extreme hypoxia for a lot of people within, in my case, 23 seconds of putting on a regular surgical mask. I'm at 85%, which is clearly hypoxic, and if you drop many points below that, you're down into organ failure and cardiac standstill land. But, the people don't know that if they're not medically trained or they're not friends and families with people who are doctors, and they think, I'm just going along to get along, and if it helps my neighbor not catch this disease, okay, well, but it's not. It's like putting a chain link fence up and hoping the flies stay out of your yard. It's 1,000 times bigger, the mesh of the mask is, than the virus particles. So not only are you not helping anybody not catch the disease, you're dropping your own oxygen levels in a way that the OSHA website, if you log on there, tells you may be irreversible. So when you're panting and you feel like your heart's beating faster, it's because it is. Your body is deprived of oxygen. It's making up for that by making your heart beat faster to send the oxygen that is in your system out to your heart and your kidneys so they don't stop working in the same way that your car stops driving when it runs out of gas. And all of these things cause overwork of your internal systems, and that can be as permanent as Karen Carpenter being anorexic and hurting her heart muscle and dying of a heart attack later in life. So these things are things that many parents, many well-meaning people just don't understand. They're like, I'll just put the mask on when I'm, out in Target, or I'm just going to put my mask on my kid. Well, it's a problem. It's a problem medically. It's a problem because it's not doing what it's intended to do. It's harming you. It's not helping your neighbor. And you're giving up ground you're never going to get back constitutionally. So, yes, I think there are severe constitutional problems with all of these things. We should not be in a system where we're contact traced, where we're digitally contact traced with our cell phones. There is a lot of precedent that says unless you are seen to be throwing a baggie of cocaine out the window, now the cop has probable cause to search your car. But if he doesn't have probable cause to search your car because you did not throw a baggie of cocaine out your window, he can't just come toss your house or your car. I mean, they can't come in to my house right now, except in the state of emergency. If they think that I've been exposed to COVID, now potentially they can come into my house and do one step further. If they think I'm going to not be compliant, they can yank me out by my feet and throw me in a quarantine camp. Those are problematic issues, and you run right up against where does the police power of the state start and stop, and where does your constitutional right to be free of government intervention, free of unreasonable searches and seizures, free of compelled communication in the form of virtue signaling by wearing a mask, where do those start and stop against each other? These are the challenging issues the courts are going to have to address. But we are not doing ourselves any favor by not standing our ground. You need to stand your ground and fight every one of these things. You need to fight your church closing down. You need to fight Target when they say you need to wear a mask. You need to fight against your school district when they tell you your kid is not coming to school on campus this year. You need to fight every damn day, every minute of the day, because if you don't, you're going to be living in North Korea before you know what hit you, in my humble opinion.
I couldn't agree more. So the key is, you got to draw the line, you got to fight the line, and you got to put as much pressure as you possibly can to stop the so-called state of emergency in
Correct.
Every state, because it's that state of emergency that opens up Pandora's box that every agencies can do pretty much whatever they want, without take away all our constitutional rights are gone with it.
Correct. You couldn't have said it better. It's a Pandora's box. The emergency powers are what gives them the in to take away rights you would otherwise have under the Constitution. So the beginning and the end of that fight is you stand on the Constitution and you get rid of the state of the emergency, and you do both, every second of the day.
Great. We're going to take a quick break. You're listening to Health Made Radio. I'm here with Leigh Dundas. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Health Made Radio. I'm Dr. Michael Karlfeldt. I'm here with human rights attorney Leigh Dundas. So let's talk about. I mean, we've said that this so-called epidemic is not really more than the average flu, and then we also said that we got to get these masks off, that they're not working. So tell me a little bit, why is this just like a normal flu? And also tell me a little bit why these masks are not working, but they may be even dangerous.
Yeah, well, symptomatically, I mean, I think we all know, even the people who don't want to admit it at this point, this is no worse than your normal flu. If you speak to people who've had COVID-19, most of them, a lot of people have had it and they didn't even know they had it. That's how come you're getting these tests where people come back positive and they're like, really? I'm not sick now, and I didn't even know I'd been sick this year because it was so mild. They sneezed once or twice 4 months ago, and they didn't even really realize they had the Rona, the COVID-19. So symptomatically, it's just no big deal. I've talked to people who ran a 99-degree temperature for one day, and then their health department was coming back and being like, oh, can you explain how dangerous this was? And they're like, but it wasn't. I wasn't ill. I've had worse days where I just had a headache from nothing, So symptomatically, it's not a problem. I think that, and then again, I'm not a doctor, so I'm a little bit outside my wheelhouse here, but putting somebody on a ventilator is basically a death sentence. You're introducing all sorts of bacteria. It's a highly invasive situation. It's hard to get them off the vents. And that's a death knell. If you can stay off a ventilator, you should. I think a lot of what you're seeing in terms of COVID deaths, legitimate COVID deaths, is the fact that you had an iatrogenic event. You put them on a ventilator, you created a much worse situation than the body was fighting initially, and the death was more attributable to the interventions that were done, like the ventilator, than the actual disease itself. We've got an inflation right now on COVID-19 in certain states. They have redefined a COVID positive test as not just counting as one test, but they now assume that all of your 16 or 17 nearest relatives and friends that you've been in contact with are also probable cases until such time as they've been tested to be negative and proven to be negative. And then secondarily, they collapse the definition of a probable COVID case into confirmed. So when you take all of the definitions and you realize what they've done, now one hot test for COVID is got a 16 or 17x multiplier in states like Texas and certain other states that we're seeing surges in. So again, and we've seen this. Florida, once the White House pulled the reporting back to HHS, suddenly Florida came out and said, oh, we might have actually overcounted our COVID positive rate by, I don't know, like 90% or just some astronomical amount. So you've got issues with reporting. You've got issues with the legitimacy of the testing. You've got issues with hospitals who are being bribed, essentially with high dollar reimbursements to call it a COVID case, even when it maybe is not really a COVID case, distorting the numbers. So that's the first issue. The second issue is just most people are asymptomatic. They're just not sick. They've got it, but they don't know they got it because they're not having any symptoms. And the real people that we need to be concerned about are the 80 and 90-year-olds who are living in assisted living facilities where 40-50% of the deaths in most of the states are coming from those facilities. I think our highest bang for our buck would be changing the manner in which we interact with those facilities. Instead of doing that, what did some of the blue Democratic governors and mayors do? What did Cuomo and de Blasio do? What did Newsom do in our state? They sent people they said were at high risk, which I disagree with. I don't think COVID is that bad of a disease. But again, I'm not a medical doctor, but that's just my take. But if you believe their narrative, this is the most dangerous thing since Ebola. And they took people they knew were damned positive, and they sent them into the most vulnerable population by sending them to a skilled nursing facility with guys in there who were 80 and 90 years old, had 2 or 3 underlying chronic conditions. Most of them had respiratory challenges already. They had COPD or some sort of, lung problem. A lot of them are immunosuppressant-type drugs. And you put those allegedly highly contagious COVID cases in with people who basically don't have an immune system. In my book, the people who did that should be tried for a war crime. They should be tried for a war crime. They were the proximal cause of multiple dozens, if not hundreds of people dying. That's a problem. In terms of the masks, how do the masks work? Why do they work? They don't work on viruses. What they do is they drop your oxygen level hypoxically low. I am talking severely hypoxically low. When our local health officer came out and said, everybody in Orange County, California, we went to our board of supervisors and said, show us the medical data saying this is safe. And because she says it's safe, but she's not proving it's safe. And in fact, what all of the medical journal data I have, which is up on my website, shows is it's actually not safe from an oxygen saturation standpoint. And of course, they couldn't provide any of the data. They just kept saying the same narrative, which is, oh, it's safe, and do it for your neighbor, and this is what we need to do. So a lot of the higher net worth, smarter people, powerful people in our county decided they were going to go put the rubber to the road. They were going to go measure their oxygen level with a pulse oximeter, which is a tiny little device that clamps onto your finger, without a mask, and they did during the next board meeting. We were all on the steps of the county hall, and their oxygen level was 99%, 98%, totally normal without the mask. And within a few minutes of putting on the masks, the handful of people who were doing this were down at an average of 86% oxygen. Now, this is to be measured against the standard by where Medicare and your insurance company will pay for you to get supplemental oxygen. You will get a supplemental oxygen tank at anything south of 88%. And our people were on average 2 points below that within 3 minutes of putting on a mask outdoors.
Two of the women. People.
What was that?
And these were healthy, fit people.
Oh, yeah. These are not guys who are 500 pounds and 90 years old. These were one of the women. Okay, so two of the participants were female. One of the women was a nurse, very healthy nurse, works out all the time. The other one was a professional runner who runs like 10, 15 miles a day. Those women dropped to 76 and 79% oxygenation, Doc, if you can believe it. That is the level, and I don't need to tell you this, you know this, where cardiac standstill occurs, where organ failure and unconsciousness occurs. And this is what happened within 3-4 minutes of putting on masks. So do not believe the mainstream news outlets when they say wearing a mask is not harmful. Do the math yourself. If you think it's not harmful, go buy yourself a pulse oximeter off Amazon, put it on your finger, go outside on a hot day, and check your own oxygen levels, and you will find what they found and what I have found. It is not safe, it is not healthy, and it's not doing a damned bit of good because the mesh on the mask is way too big to contain the virus particle. It just passes right through.
So how about they say that the virus come in this little sputum things, as you're coughing, and that the mask protects against that. The droplet,
the droplet, the aerosolized. Well, the interesting thing to note on that, and I know we're winding up on your 45 minutes here, is in England is where the social distancing rule came from, the 6 feet of social distance. And again, this was based on absolutely nothing. We have the leading UK British researcher coming out in the press on the record a couple of weeks ago, and he said, and I quote, that the experts came to him and said they, quote, didn't think the British population would understand what 1 meter of distance was, which is 3 feet in the U.S. We're on the, not the metric system. Didn't understand what 1 meter was. So to be on the safe side, they doubled the social distancing rule to be 2 meters. He went on in that same interview to state, and again I quote, that it was literally, the 6 foot social distance rule, it was, quote, literally conjured up out of nowhere, end quote. And the final statement was that it was not scientifically grounded, but basically a rule of thumb. What you actually realize when you go to, again, to the medical literature that predated this COVID pandemic, fake pandemic, is that, to the extent you're going to want to stay away from anybody, it's about a 3 foot rule. And you need to do what you always did, which is when you sneeze, don't go up to your best friend and sneeze in their face. Pull your shirt up, cover your face, sneeze into your T-shirt or your crook of your elbow when you're turned away, and go about your merry business. The droplets will start to fall to the ground. They don't necessarily come straight out, especially if you're sneezing into your elbow or your shirt, and that's enough to be safe. And that is what the actual studies show. But are we listening to the actual studies? No. We listened to one British researcher who let his experts talk him into the fact that he should play scaredy cat, and now the entire world is unable to go back to school because we're supposed to have 6 feet of distance around every single school child, which means you can't get 30 kids in a classroom. You can only get 12 to 15 in a class. And that is quite unfortunate because we are sacrificing our future planet's guardians generation of kids who are going to be responsible for the stewardship of this planet at the altar of people who are not making their decisions based on science but based on fear.
And tell me a little bit about the kind of the 6-foot rule. I mean, the impact, because you were talking a lot about isolation in the past and how that is used as a tool to pretty much break down
correct.
Prisoners. I mean, this
yes.
is a war tactic. And
it
so
is.
This is being then deployed on a large scale on the population. Tell me a little bit more about that.
Well, I'll give you the nutshell version, but basically in 1951, a group of British, Canadian, and American military intelligence officers wanted to figure out the best way of breaking down enemies of state. And they had a little quiet time meeting at the Ritz-Carlton, I believe it was in Montreal, and they spent a week figuring out what they were going to do, and they commissioned studies. And what these studies determined over the succeeding years is that social isolation, which is a euphemism for social distancing, but it's really social isolation, is the ideal way of breaking down a prisoner. And it is, quote, as effective as if they were beaten, starved, or deprived of sleep. Senator John McCain, when he came back from Vietnam, he had spent over a half decade in a prisoner of war camp. More than half of that was socially isolated or distanced from his other GI colleagues. And he said, it is an awful thing, and it crushes your spirit more effectively than any other form of mistreatment. What other folks don't know medically is, although we're starting to feel it, even though we don't know it, the medical studies show it causes depression, poor sleep quality, impaired executive functioning, cognitive decline, poor cardio function, poor immunity. It doubles your risk of death if you're a black person. It nearly doubles it if you're Caucasian. And frighteningly, especially when you're talking about social distancing of children who are returning to school this week and next, it is the medical equivalent, being socially isolated or distant, is the medical equivalent of smoking 15 cigarettes a day and being an alcoholic, and it destroys the part of your brain responsible for learning, which is your ventral striatum. So put simply, we would be better off sending our kids to school with an ice pick to perform a frontal lobotomy, a packet and a half of cigarettes, and a fifth of Jack Daniels on their way into homeroom. They'd be about as well off as they are with the social distancing protocols.
Oh, yeah, that's just atrocious, and yeah, that's atrocious. And also, I mean, the impact. I read also that it's, it equals somebody that has incurred a traumatic injury to the brain.
Yes, it is the same when they do functional MRI scans on the POWs who came back. Both, I think they did a study in Europe. They did MRIs, and then they did some other types of brain scans, and then the POWs from other wars, they found it was the equivalent of having sustained a traumatic brain injury, and there were actual structural changes to the brain that had occurred from the isolation that didn't necessarily go back to normal just because you brought the person out of isolation. It is one of the reasons that in recent history, the UN has moved away from that, and they've actually come out and said they consider more than 15 days of social distancing or isolation to be basically a war crime. It's cruel and inhumane punishment. It's on the level of a war crime, and they recommend against more than 2 weeks of it because it's so traumatic to the individual.
So now we are doing the social distancing that has that impact on the brain. In addition to, then we're running around with masks that are stopping oxygen to get into the brain. So obviously we're then creating a population that is going to be very easily controlled and guided in whatever direction you want them to go. Yep.
Yeah, and you're also creating other problems. You know, I work in sex trafficking. You put a mask on a kid, they can't be heard when they're screaming and crying. They all look alike. When you're hauling them out of Target, you've got a perpetrator who looks just like everybody else because all you can see are their eyeballs, and they got brown hair. My husband was physically assaulted by some paid counter-protesters when we were standing in line 2-3 weeks ago at a board meeting here in Orange County. They did a lineup. Not the easiest thing to identify the person who assaulted him when they look just like every other guy with a mask on. So we are creating other problems in terms of child abuse, child trafficking, but even setting that aside, the psychological, the medical damage that you're doing by depriving kids of oxygen 8 hours a day or more, by putting them on screen time where we know it puts their brain to sleep and they don't learn effectively from screens and Zoom calls, and you're depriving them of socialization and you're masking them, and you're making them be obedient, you're making them play with the ball by themselves, stay 6 feet away from everybody else. You could conceive of no better way to break down a society than to do the exact frickin' things we are doing to our children right now. And if you have a kid, and even if you don't have a kid, you should be standing in front of your nearest teachers union or your nearest, school board building, your nearest school, and getting all of the data to them. All of the data I have is up on my website. You are free to borrow it, use it, take the letter, print it off, cross out my name, put your name on, I don't care. But we need to start educating those who don't know what this is doing as to what it is actually doing to the children and to us before it's too late.
And the last point that I want to address before we finish is in regards to people in the workplace, having to wear a mask, and also the impact it has on the, because they are supposed to be protected by OSHA. And
they are.
Here they are forced into wear a mask. So what are the implications there?
Well, it's super ironic because OSHA is the federal agency that's supposed to protect workplace safety. Most states have their own state version of a Cal OSHA or a Michigan OSHA. And if you were to look at any of the publications prior to COVID, it talks about how you have to have a fit test for the mask. And that's not to make sure the mask fits your face. It's to make sure that you have the fitness level in your body that will endure through sustained periods of mask wearing, because maybe you have an undiagnosed heart condition where you're going to have a heart attack right away if you start going hypoxic compared to the average bear. Maybe you have a lung condition you didn't know about. Maybe you're brewing cancer somewhere, and shutting down your oxygen intake and creating an acidosis or an acidic environment is going to foster the creation of more tumors. I mean, there's all sorts of things that are contributed to negatively by mask wearing and hypoxic levels of oxygen that are created by the mask wearing, and OSHA knows this. And if you look at any of the OSHA data prior to 4 months ago, it's there for you to see, which is mask wearing is not necessarily safe. And before you do it in the workplace, you need to make darn sure the person's body can sustain this. And instead, right now, we're just throwing that all out, pretending it doesn't exist. Well, my statement to the masses, not that this is legal advice or the formation of an attorney-client relationship, is go educate yourself. And if you are working in a big box store, if you're working in a hair salon, and you do not feel healthy, if you've got a headache, if you're fuzzy-headed, if your neck hurts, if you're getting little tics and twitches, those are all signs of hypoxia that are on the OSHA website. And you are well within your rights, as I understand it, to make an OSHA complaint. And I would not risk my health by wearing a mask at work if I thought it was negatively affecting my body. Call up OSHA and make them prove that you can actually wear a mask safely. My guess is if you're feeling badly, although I'm not a doctor, it's probably not safe for you, and an actual fitness test with oxygen monitoring of you in your mask would prove that out. At which point, you now have OSHA on your side hitting back against your employer and your county and your state or wherever the order is coming from, saying at least this person cannot safely wear that mask. The other thing you can do if you're not working somewhere is if you feel poorly in a mask, you can go to your own doctor. Ask him to see how low your oxygen goes. And if it goes low when you're in a mask to a hypoxic level, you can get him to write a letter saying, hey, this is not safe for patient X to do this. And then when you're in a store as a patron, or you're in a church, or you're in a school, and they say you need a mask, you can whip out your letter and say, it's unsafe for me to wear a mask. I have a disability that is triggered by mask wearing where I go hypoxic, and I'm not going to risk a heart attack or organ failure or unconsciousness just because you say I have to. At that point, the store is supposed to do a reasonable accommodation and let you in without the mask or service you some other way. If they don't, you have now set the stage for an ADA lawsuit, Americans with Disability lawsuit, and in California, a state law counterpart that actually charges it's a $4,000 monetary damage assessment minimum if the store refuses to accommodate a person with a disability. And I think if we start having the lawyers and doctors in our lives fight this battle based on the medical science that shows for many people mask wearing is not actually safe on an O2 basis, on an oxygen level basis, we will at that point have an ability to push back against the governments that are making a one-size-fit-all mandate that is not scientifically grounded.
Well, Leigh, it's been such a pleasure to have you on the show, and I'm so grateful for that you picked up this sword to fight this fight. I'm really grateful.
I'm grateful to have the opportunity to share what I've learned so that other people can join the army of people preserving our civil liberties and human rights.
Yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, if the people says no, the government can't say no to all the people.
Correct. Yeah, if everybody did their part, we'd be done with this in a heartbeat, and that's what we need to do. And the more people who know, the better. I am a firm believer that good triumphs over evil. I'm a firm believer, I'm an optimist, and I really believe that when people know better, they do better. And so partly this is an educational fight as much as anything else. The more people who are hearing the data, the more they can be armed up with it to go fight their battles in their neck of the woods. And I wish them well, and if they need any words of wisdom, they can always give us a call.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And where would be the best resource where they can find this information?
Yeah, so the website for the nonprofit I'm doing this work with, it's my nonprofit. It's Advocates for Citizens' Rights, and the website address is www.citizens-rights.org. So it's citizens' rights with a little hyphen in between there, .org. And they can always reach me by email as well. It's leigh.esq@gmail.com. It sometimes takes me a bit of time to get back to folks, but I do eventually get back to everybody.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Leigh. I truly appreciate this information.
You're welcome, Doc. Thanks for having me on the show today.
Thank you. That is it for today. You're listening to HealthMade Radio. Remember, check us out at healthmade.co. Health is what you make it.